Thank you. Massimo asked about more details about the economic and financial microstructure. Now, one issue which has arisen in debate would have been the comparative exchange systems between Jamaica and Barbados, where Barbados has a fixed exchange rate system and Jamaica has a managed float. Now, and the superficial comparison is that in the context of the fixed exchange rate system, and I say superficial deliberately, Barbados has lower risk, lower interest rates, and so on, and Jamaica has higher risk, higher interest rates, which is supposed to be a disincentive to investment. But when you look below those choices, the fact is that both countries came out of the colonial relationship with Britain with a peg to sterling, which were then changed to pegs to the United States dollar. Now, if the exchange rate system, could guarantee fiscal prudence, Jamaica would still have had fiscal prudence and still would have had a fixed exchange rate system. The fact is that somewhere along the line, Jamaica's fiscal policy deviated and we lost our capacity to peg the exchange rate. And in terms of managing the float in Jamaica, because of persistent fiscal deviations, Jamaica has found itself in a situation of constantly trying to substitute monetary policy for fiscal policy, for what fiscal policy ought to be doing. So the interest rates tend to be uncompetitive, but that is fundamentally not because of bad monetary policy, not because of what they call colloquially a high interest rate policy in Jamaica, but because fiscal policy has been bad. And so, I mean, I just want to, so we still go back to the issues in terms of why Jamaica went off the rails in terms of its fiscal policy compared to Barbados. Barbados has maintained its peg because its fiscal policy has been consistently better. And in 1990, 91, 92, when Barbados had its crisis, maybe, I don't know if this is a cultural issue, but that commitment to the exchange peg, people in Barbados were prepared to collectively decide to make a sacrifice where public servants would take wage cuts to preserve that peg. So that level of collective social support for an objective and so on is something that you see operating in Barbados. Thank you. And no, if I may just add very quickly, in terms of the financial system, Jamaica definitely has a more sophisticated and deeper financial system than Barbados. We have a more sophisticated financial system, but the interest rates are not necessarily friendly to the allocation of credit for growth. Thanks.
I'd just like to ask Colin a clarifying question. Are you arguing that, so while the government of Jamaica was essentially changing monetary policy to for good purposes, as they saw it, were not paying attention to fiscal policy and essentially had left fiscal policy to sort of take care of itself and use fiscal policy more for political motivations and try to compensate for it then with monetary policy? Is that sort of the story you have in mind?
That bad fiscal policy, if I may call it that, lost Jamaica's exchange peg. But we all want the same things. We want relative exchange rate stability. We want low inflation. We want strong investment. We want high growth. So we lose the peg and we have a floating exchange rate. We liberalized our exchange system in less than ideal circumstances. Our regulatory framework was not appropriate. Our macroeconomic support for the float was not appropriate, and the exchange rate went through the roof. Jamaica in 1990 to 91, we had 12-month inflation of over 100% for the first and hopefully the last time in Jamaica's history. So what my basic thesis here is that it is weak fiscal policy which led to the dismantling of Jamaica's fixed exchange rate system. We're trying to get, we float and we want relative stability. But while we want relative stability, admittedly, a part of our fiscal and debt problems came out of a financial crisis in the middle of the 1990s. But that financial sector crisis arose because we liberalized with less than appropriate financial system regulation. But throughout, facing the challenge of trying to stabilize through fiscal policy. I mean, Jamaica has a record of setting fiscal targets every year and missing them. I don't, Dr. Hughes, you're going to change that, right? I mean, we're going to meet our fiscal objectives for the first time at last, hopefully. But the basic idea here is that weak fiscal policy means that you have been trying to stabilize your exchange system through the use of monetary policy, which pushes up interest rates. Thanks.
Okay, so just to end my point and to sort of bring it back to the discussion on institutions, unfortunately, John Bender is not here, but yesterday he talked about democracies, dictatorships, and really dumb decisions, and his paper was all about overconfidence of leaders. And now I wasn't following completely his paper, but the story you're telling sounds a lot like the story John Bender was telling about overconfidence of leaders and leaders essentially selecting bad policies, and the fact that you know the institutions allowed that to happen. So it's for a lack of understanding the policies that these things were in place.
One thing that I quite liked about this discussion and about Peter's paper is that I think sort of it points to a little pet peeve that I often have with economists, and that is that we often separate and delineate what we call markets and what we call private sector, public sector, as if they're just two completely different spheres. And I think, you know, we all know in a deep way that that's not the case, that there's no such thing as a market constitutes a set of rules, and who enforces those set of rules. Obviously, that's a government enterprise at some level. And what strikes me about some of the numbers that Susan put out is that, you know, this is precisely about, it's not just about government size, you know, government spending, government taxation, but it's about the way in which public sector and private sector interact through the rule of law, through the definition of property rights, through the adjudication of disputes and things like this. And I think that we don't really understand that symbiosis very well. And so when we talk about differences in Barbados and Jamaica, and I know very little about this at the outset, what strikes me is that we may want to look, rather than concentrating just on public sector, fiscal monetary policy, private sector, credit constraints, things like this, is we may want to look at that kind of interaction. That seems to be where some of the action might be, and that it's so that this panel is quite encouraging in that respect.
I have to let me just intervene because I want to support what Colin said. In spite of what Roger said and some of the, I think it very much is about fiscal policy, and I think it very much is about, for example, bad fiscal policy under Manley. One of the further to support Colin said, I think his history shows from many examples that exchange rate policy, fixed exchange rates, cannot enforce fiscal discipline. And to take an example I know better, in Israel in the 1980s, that we learned at the time that people talked about different monetary arrangements, but the question was fiscal discipline. And once you got the fiscal discipline, you reduced the deficit, then stabilization was possible. When I was reading Peter's paper and his story about this agreement in Barbados about what seemed to be a general deflation, it reminded me of the different experiences of Israel and Argentina in the mid-1980s. In the mid-1980s, Israel and Argentina both did stabilization plans at similar, very high inflation rates, very similar plans. Now, the Israeli plan succeeded for a number of reasons that Argentina didn't have, but the reason that the Argentinian plan failed at the time is that public sector workers, especially teachers, pushed for very high wage increases, and the government gave in to those wage increases, and after a short period of fiscal discipline, deficit started again. So there too, stabilization works, growth works when you have the fiscal discipline, And if you can't have the sort of thing that Barbados had, if you have this